The last thing the demon of the district expected to find inside his fortress was a pair of worn-out sneakers. It was 3 a.m. when Dae-seon Cha was stalking through the east wing of his mansion. The storm raged outside. He walked in silence, hunting a noise he'd heard moments ago. Not a footstep, not a weapon cocking, but a soft, terrified breathing coming from the guest room closet. He gripped his gun, his knuckles white against the dark metal. In his world, a noise in the dark meant an assassin. Tonight, it meant something far more complicated. He ripped open the closet door and froze. There, curled inward behind a row of pristine Italian suits, was a boy. No older than 9, pale, hugging his knees to his chest, looking like he had been trying to disappear into the wall itself. In his hands, he didn't hold a weapon or stolen jewelry. He held a dirty backpack and a silver locket. He wasn't a spy. He wasn't a thief. He was homeless. And when Dae-seon stepped closer, the boy didn't scream. He held up a crumpled photo of Dae-seon from 10 years ago and whispered the words that shattered the hitman's composure. She said you were the only one the bad men were scared of. Dae-seon's chest tightened. The air left his lungs. The eyes looking back at him were Elena's. The face was his own. The boy squeezed his eyes shut, shaking, as if hiding in the dark would protect him from the giant standing over him. For a long moment, the ruthless enforcer couldn't breathe. Then he slowly lowered his gun and did something that would terrify his enemies more than any bullet. Stay with me until the end. Because the moment Dae-seon Cha realized he was a father, he didn't just save a boy. He started a war to protect him. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. The east wing of the Cha estate was supposed to be a tomb, silent, cold, and empty. At 3 a.m., the only sound should have been the rhythmic lashing of rain against the bulletproof glass. But Dae-seon Cha heard breathing. It was faint, a ragged hitching sound that didn't belong to the house's settling timber, or the hum of the HVAC system. Dae-seon moved down the corridor, his bare feet making no sound on the imported marble. He was a man sculpted by violence, his broad shoulders tense, his grip tightening on the custom pistol at his side. His unbuttoned dress shirt hung loose, exposing the dark ink of tattoos that crawled up his chest, a warning label for anyone foolish enough to cross him. He didn't call security. He didn't need them. In his world, an intruder meant one thing: a contract. Someone had slipped past the perimeter, past the dogs, past the sensors. That meant they were a professional. Dae-seon stopped outside the guest bedroom. The door was cracked open an inch, leaking a sliver of darkness into the hallway. The breathing was louder now, desperate. He raised his weapon, the cold metal pressed against his palm, grounding him. His heart rate didn't spike. It slowed. This was the only part of his life that made sense. The hunt. He nudged the door open with his elbow, the barrel of his gun sweeping the room. The bed was empty. The windows were secure. Then a rustle. It came from the walk-in closet. Dae-seon's jaw tightened. He moved to the side of the closet door, counting the beats of silence. 1, 2, 3. He ripped the door open, swinging into the frame with lethal precision, his finger taking up the slack on the trigger. He expected a silhouette. He expected a knife, a silencer, a fight that would end in blood. "Don't move," he snarled, his voice a gravelly command that usually made grown men wet themselves. But there was no assassin. Dae-seon blinked, the adrenaline curdling into confusion. His weapon wavered, though he didn't lower it. Huddled on the floor, wedged between a row of $2,000 Italian suits and a stack of leather storage boxes, was a child. The boy couldn't have been more than 9 years old. He was tiny, a fragility that seemed impossible in Dae-seon's world of iron and concrete. He was curled into a tight ball, his knees pulled to his chest, making himself as small as physically possible. His hair was light and matted, his skin pale enough to be translucent in the dim light. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was clutching a dirty, frayed backpack to his chest like a shield. The boy looked up. His eyes were wide, dominated by a terror so pure it felt like a physical blow to Dae-seon's gut. This wasn't the look of a thief caught in the act. It was the look of a prey animal cornered by a wolf. Daesun stood there, a towering giant of muscle and violence, looming over a shivering child who looked like he hadn't eaten a warm meal in weeks. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The demon of the district had prepared for a war, but he had absolutely no defense for this. The boy flinched, knees squeezing the backpack tighter, his voice barely a whisper against the thunder outside. "I didn't steal anything." Daesun didn't holster his weapon immediately. Old habits died hard, and trust was a currency he didn't spend on strangers, not even small ones with terrified eyes. But the boy's trembling was vibrating the floorboards, a frantic, rabbit-like shaking that made the gun in Daeseon's hand feel absurdly heavy. "Up," Daeseon commanded. His voice was quieter now, stripped of the growl, but it still carried the weight of iron. The boy scrambled to his feet, clutching the dirty backpack like it contained gold bullion. He didn't run. He didn't try to bolt past the giant blocking the doorway. He just stood there, waiting to be hurt. "Kitchen," Daeseon said, nodding his head toward the hallway. The walk was a study in contrasts. Daeseon moved with the predatory grace of a panther, his bare feet silent on the cold marble. The boy trailed behind him, his worn-out sneakers squeaking with every step, flinching whenever Daeseon checked over his shoulder. The kitchen was a cavern of stainless steel and black granite, lit by the harsh blue glow of the refrigerator display. It was a space designed for professional chefs, not for a bachelor who ate takeout over dossiers of rival gang members. Daeseon gestured to one of the high stools at the island. The boy climbed up, his legs dangling a foot off the ground. Daeseon opened the pantry. It was stocked with ingredients he couldn't pronounce, but hidden behind a jar of artisanal truffle oil, he found a dented can of chicken noodle soup. He cracked it open, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silence. He wasn't a cook. He poured the cold, gelatinous contents into a bowl and shoved it into the microwave. 2 minutes. The hum of the machine was the only sound in the mansion. Daeseon leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his tattooed chest, watching the intruder. The boy was staring at the microwave door as if it were a television playing the most interesting show on earth. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly. When the timer beeped, Daeseon slid the steaming bowl across the granite island along with a silver spoon. "Hot," Daeseon warned. "Don't burn yourself." The warning was unnecessary. The boy didn't wait. He grabbed the spoon with a fist, shoveling the broth and noodles into his mouth with a frantic, animalistic desperation. Broth splashed onto his chin, but he didn't stop to wipe it. He ate like someone who didn't know when, or if, he would ever see food again. Daeseon watched, a strange, uncomfortable knot tightening in his stomach. He had seen greed in the eyes of men who wanted his territory. He had seen lust in the eyes of politicians who wanted his money. But this wasn't greed. This was starvation. As the boy reached for a piece of bread Daeseon had tossed onto the plate, the sleeve of his oversized sweater rode up his arm. Daeseon's eyes narrowed. There were marks on the boy's forearm, dark, yellowing bruises in the shape of fingers, grab marks, and higher up, near the elbow, a thin, straight welt that looked like it came from a belt buckle. Daeseon knew violence. He was a scholar of it. He knew the difference between a bruise from falling off a bike and a bruise from being held down. These were the latter. The realization hit him colder than the rain outside. The boy hadn't broken into the fortress of the demon of the district to steal silver or spy for a rival. He had broken in because the monsters outside were worse than the monster inside. "Slow down," Daeseon said, his voice surprisingly soft. "There's more if you want it." The boy froze, spoon halfway to his mouth, eyes darting up to meet Daeseon's. For the first time, the fear in them receded just enough to reveal something else. Hope. The sound of the spoon scraping against the ceramic bowl was the only thing keeping Daeseon anchored to reality. The boy was licking the broth off the spoon now, his initial frantic hunger settling into a rhythmic, desperate need to consume every calorie. Daeseon pulled his gaze away from the bruises on the boy's arm and looked at the backpack sitting on the counter. It was a cheap canvas thing, stained with mud and fraying at the seams. It looked like trash, but the boy had guarded it like a vault. "I need to know who's looking for you," Daeseon said, his voice low. It wasn't a question. The boy froze, the spoon hovering halfway to his mouth. He looked at the bag, then at DeSeon's face, measuring the threat. He didn't argue. He just slumped slightly, a resignation that was too old for his face, and went back to his soup. DeSeon slid the bag closer. The zipper was rusted and stuck halfway, requiring a sharp tug to open. Inside, it smelled of wet cardboard and stale air. DeSeon reached in, his large hand feeling out of place among the contents. There was no wallet, no phone, no ID card. Just the detritus of survival. A crushed granola bar wrapper, a singular dirty sock, a plastic water bottle refilled so many times the plastic was crinkling, and a small, heavy object wrapped carefully in a fast food napkin. DeSeon ignored the trash and picked up the wrapped object. It felt dense, purposeful. He unfolded the napkin. It was a silver locket. The metal was tarnished, the chain knotted, but the surface was polished smooth, as if a thumb had rubbed it 1,000 times in worry. It was a delicate, feminine thing, completely at odds with the grime of the backpack. DeSeon stared at it. A cold prickle of recognition danced down his spine. He had seen this before. He had bought this before. A terrifying weight settled in his stomach, heavier than the gun on his hip. With a thumb that suddenly felt numb, he pried the locket open. The hinge creaked, revealing 2 tiny, circular photographs protected by yellowing plastic. On the left was a woman with laughing eyes and dark curls. Elena. On the right was a man. He was younger, his face unlined by the brutality of the last decade. His smile genuine, lacking the cold edge it carried now. It was DeSeon. The air left the kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator, the rain, the boys breathing. It all vanished into a ringing silence. DeSeon gripped the counter, the marble biting into his palms, as the room tilted on its axis. He hadn't seen that face in 10 years. He hadn't seen Elena since the night he put her on a train with a bag of cash and a lie that he didn't love her anymore, just to get her away from the crosshairs of his enemies. He had saved her. He had sent her away to live a life without him. He looked up from the silver ghost in his hand. The boy had stopped eating. He was watching DeSeon, his expression guarded, waiting for the anger. DeSeon looked at him. Really looked at him. For the first time. He stripped away the dirt, the hunger, and the fear. He looked at the shape of the brow, the stubborn set of the chin. And then he looked at the eyes. They weren't just brown. They were Elena's eyes. The math crashed into DeSeon like a sledgehammer. 10 years. He wasn't looking at an intruder. He was looking at the reason Elena had never come back. The cotton swab went into the plastic tube with a soft click that sounded like a chamber being loaded. DeSeon had summoned Dr. Eris within minutes of finding the locket. The old man, who had stitched up more bullet wounds than he cared to count, hadn't asked questions. No, he had simply arrived, swabbed the inside of the terrified boy's cheek, and retreated to the mansion's medical bay to run the rapid analysis. Now, DeSeon sat in his office, the heavy oak door locked against the world. The room was a monument to his power. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a mahogany desk that cost more than most people's homes, and a wall of glass overlooking the storm-lashed city. But tonight, the luxury felt like a cage. He poured a glass of amber whiskey, his hand steady though a tremor vibrated deep in his chest. He didn't drink it. He just held the crystal tumbler, watching the condensation weep down the sides, mirroring the rain on the window. It's impossible, he told himself. The thought was a mantra. I sent her away. She was safe. She never told me. He replayed the last night he saw Elena, the train station, and the rain. It was always raining in his memories of her. He had been cruel on purpose, breaking her heart so she would leave and never look back. He had done it to keep his blood-soaked world from ever touching her. If the boy downstairs was his, then he hadn't saved her. He had abandoned her. And worse, he had abandoned his son to a world that left bruises on a 9-year-old's arms. The intercom buzzed, a harsh electric tear in the silence. DeSeon stared at it. The red light blinked, a rhythmic warning. He pressed the button. "Report," he rasped. His voice sounded like it had been dragged over gravel. "The markers are definitive, DeSeon." Dr. Eris's voice came through, tinny and clinical. There was a pause, heavy with the weight of a life changing forever. It's a 99.9% match, and the boy is your biological son. Dacian didn't reply. He couldn't. He released the button. The silence rushed back in, deafening and absolute. My son. The words didn't make sense. They didn't fit in his mouth. He was a destroyer, a reaper, a shadow. He wasn't a creator. He wasn't a father. The whiskey glass slipped from his fingers. It hit the thick Persian rug with a dull thud, not breaking, but spilling the dark liquor like a stain spreading across the wool. A sudden, violent wave of nausea surged up his throat. The room tilted. The smell of the whiskey, the smell of the rain, the smell of his own expensive cologne. It all became suffocating. Dacian lurched from his chair, stumbling toward the private bathroom attached to the office. He barely made it to the porcelain basin before his stomach rebelled. He gripped the edges of the sink, won his knuckles white, heaving until there was nothing left but bile and the sour taste of panic. He spat, breathing heavily, sweat beading on his forehead. He looked up at the mirror. The face staring back was pale, the eyes wild. It was the face of the demon of the district. But now that demon had a name he never wanted. Father. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, staring at his reflection with a mixture of horror and awe. He had built an empire on the promise that he had nothing to lose. Now, he had everything to lose. The cold water from the tap didn't wash away the truth, but it shocked the panic out of his system. Dacian stared at his dripping reflection in the bathroom mirror. The nausea had subsided, replaced by a terrifying, icy clarity. He was a man who solved problems. That was his job. If a shipment was seized, he found a new route. If a man betrayed him, he removed the man. Now he had a son who carried the blood of a woman he had failed, and a father who was a walking target. The logic was brutal, but it was the only language Dacian spoke. I am the danger. To save the boy, I must remove myself. He walked back into his office, the tremor in his hands gone, replaced by the rigid tension of a soldier preparing for a suicide mission. He picked up his secure phone and dialed a number he usually reserved for cleaning up crime scenes. Silas, Dacian said when the line clicked open. Boss, it's 4 a.m. I need a placement, Dacian said, staring out at the rain-lashed skyline. Switzerland, the Institute of dem Rosenberg, or La Rosie, whichever has higher walls and tighter security. There was a pause on the other end, heavy with confusion. For a client? For a dependent, Dacian said, the word tasting like ash. Immediate admission. Money is not an object. I want the tuition paid through university. I want a trust fund set up that matures when he's 21. And I want a plane ready at the airstrip in 2 hours. 2 hours? Dacian, the paperwork alone. Buy the school if you have to, Silas. Just get it done. He hung up before the lawyer could ask the question that hung in the air. Who is it? Dacian didn't pack a bag for himself. He wasn't going. He would deliver the package and return to the mud and the blood where he belonged. He moved down the hallway to the guest room. The door was still cracked open. Inside, the only light came from the hallway, cutting a golden slice across the king-sized bed. Bartley was asleep. He looked even smaller now, swallowed by the Egyptian cotton sheets. He was curled on his side, one hand tucked under his cheek, his breathing a soft, rhythmic hitch that sounded too fragile for this world. Dacian approached the bed like he was defusing a bomb. He looked down at the boy, his son. The urge to reach out and brush the hair from the boy's forehead was overwhelming, a physical ache in his chest. He shoved his hands into his pockets. He couldn't touch him. He was poison. Everything he touched eventually bled. Quietly, methodically, Dacian picked up the dirty canvas backpack from the floor. He moved around the room, gathering the boy's few pathetic belongings. The worn sneakers, the sweater with the hole in the elbow, the locket, which he placed gently in the front pocket. He zipped the bag shut. The sound was loud in the silence. Bartley stirred, murmuring something unintelligible, brow furrowing in a dream. Dacian froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He watched the boy settle again. It's for your own good, Dacian whispered to the sleeping child, the lie burning his tongue. You can't grow up in a graveyard. He set the backpack by the door, a tombstone for a relationship that had ended before it even began. He would be the villain in the boy's story, the father who sent him away. But at least the boy would be alive to tell it. Daishin was halfway down the hall, phone in hand to confirm the jet, when the scream tore through the silence. It wasn't a cry of annoyance or a child waking up from a bad dream. It was a raw, guttural shriek of pure terror, the sound of an animal caught in a trap. Dacian didn't think. No, he didn't strategize. He moved. The phone clattered to the floor as he spun around, sprinting back toward the guest room. He burst through the door, gun drawn instinctively before he remembered the enemy wasn't physical. Bartley was thrashing in the center of the massive bed, tangled in the silk sheets. His eyes were wide open, but seeing nothing in the room. He was screaming at ghosts. No, please, I'll be quiet, I promise, I'll be quiet. The words hit Dacian like physical blows. I'll be quiet. It was the plea of a child who had learned that silence was the only way to survive. Dacian holstered the gun and approached the bed. Bartley. The boy didn't hear him. He was flailing, fighting off invisible hands. Don't take me back. Please, the bad men, Dacian grabbed the boy's shoulders. The contact was electric. But Bartley was burning up, sweat soaking through his thin t-shirt. Bartley, wake up! Dacian roared, his voice cracking the nightmare open. Bartley gasped, his whole body seizing. He blinked, the terror in his eyes slowly refocusing from the horrors of the street to the face of the man looming over him. For a second, Dacian expected the boy to recoil. He was the demon after all. He was the monster who had packed the boy's bag to send him away. But Bartley didn't pull away. With a sob that broke Dacian's heart in two, the boy lunged forward. He wrapped his skinny arms around Dacian's neck, burying his face in the rough cotton of the dress shirt. He clung with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a starving child. Don't let them take me. Bartley wept into Dacian's shoulder. Please, mister. I'll be good. I won't eat much. Just don't make me go back. Dacian froze. His hands hovered awkwardly in the air. He was a man who killed with his hands. He didn't comfort. He didn't hug. But the boy was shaking so hard his teeth were chattering. He smelled like rain and fear and something that smelled faintly like Elena. Slowly, terrifyingly, Dacian lowered his arms. One large hand settled on the boy's back. The other cupped the back of his head, protective and firm. You're not going back, Dacian rumbled. The vibration of his voice seemed to steady the boy. But the bag, Bartley hiccuped, pulling back just enough to look at the backpack by the door. You packed my bag. Dacian looked at the bag, the Swiss boarding school, the safety, the distance. It all seemed like a cruel joke now. How could he send this terrified, the broken bird to a cold institution in the mountains? They wouldn't know how to wake him from these nightmares. They wouldn't know that silence was a trauma response, not good behavior. Dacian tightened his grip. The ice around his heart, the fortress he had built for 10 years, shattered. No, Dacian said, and his voice was fierce, final. That was a mistake. He reached over to the nightstand, grabbed the phone he had dropped, and dialed Silas. Cancel the jet, Dacian ordered, ignoring the confused sputtering on the other end. Cancel the school. Cancel everything. Boss, what do I tell the pilot? Tell him to go home. Dacian hung up and looked down at the boy, still clinging to his shirt. He pulled the blanket up, tucking it around Bartley's shoulders with a gentleness that terrified him. You stay, Dacian whispered, when a vow made in the dark. I keep you. The sun had barely risen over the wet city streets when Dacian convened the most unusual war council of his career. 3 of his deadliest lieutenants stood in the grand foyer, hands clasped respectfully behind their backs. These were men who had dismantled rival cartels and negotiated international arms deals. They looked terrifying. The objective is simple, Dacian said, pacing in front of them with the intensity of a general before D-Day. The boy needs equipment. Marco, a man with a scar running through his left eyebrow and a neck as thick as a tree trunk, frowned. Equipment boss? Like Kevlar? A secure perimeter? No. Dacian pinched the bridge of his nose. He's 9. He needs joy, entertainment, comfort. He waved a hand vaguely. Get him the best. Expense is not an issue. If he looks at it and smiles, buy it. If you have to threaten a store manager to open early, do it. Understood. Marco nodded gravely. Operation Joy. We move out. 3 hours later, a convoy of black SUVs returned, followed by 2 delivery trucks. Bartley was sitting at the top of the grand staircase, still wearing his oversized pajamas, clutching the banister like a lifeline. He watched with wide, saucer-like eyes as the supplies began to enter the house. It was a disaster of good intentions. First came the candy. Not a bag or even a box. 2 enforcers hauled in a wooden crate filled to the brim with high-end Swiss chocolates, gummy bears by the kilo, and lollipops the size of hubcaps. They dumped it on the coffee table like they were offloading contraband. Sugar boosts morale, Marco explained stoically. Next came the toys. Dacian had expected maybe a video game or a bicycle. Instead, his men wheeled in a fully functional gas-powered mini motorcycle that looked dangerous enough to kill a grown man. Following that was a limited edition, life-sized replica of a samurai sword, blunt mostly, and a collector's edition chess set made of solid jade. For critical thinking, another lieutenant grunted, placing a box of vintage comic books on top of the jade. Then, the pièce de résistance. The front doors were thrown wide open. A frantic clattering of hooves echoed against the marble floors. Bartley stood up, his mouth dropping open. Marco walked in, looking incredibly pleased with himself, leading a live Shetland pony on a diamond-studded leash. The pony looked confused. It whinnied, the sound reverberating off the crystal chandelier. Dacian stared at the animal. He stared at Marco. He stared at the pile of sugar and weapons. Marco, Dacian said, his voice dangerously low. Why is there a horse in my house? The pet store didn't have any tigers, boss. Marco replied earnestly. The kid looks sad. Ponies make people happy. It's a statistical fact. Dacian rubbed his temples. He looked up at the landing. Bartley was looking down at the chaos. The pony pooping on the Italian tile, the mountain of chocolate, the deadly motorcycle. It was absurd. It was terrifying. It was the most ridiculous display of affection Dacian had ever witnessed. And then, a sound cut through the tension. A giggle. Dacian looked up sharply. Bartley had a hand over his mouth, his shoulders shaking. The giggle turned into a laugh, a rusty, quiet sound that seemed to surprise the boy as much as anyone else. Is that for me? Bartley whispered, pointing at the pony. Dacian looked at the defecating animal, then back at his son. He sighed, a long, defeated exhalation. Yes, Dacian said, resigning himself to his fate. Everything is for you. The laughter over the pony didn't last. It was a fragile thing, shattered just hours later by the harsh reality of a body pushed too far. The adrenaline of survival had kept Bartley going for weeks in that cold closet. But now that he was safe, his defenses collapsed. The crash was sudden and terrifying. It started with a cough, a wet, rattling sound deep in the boy's chest. By midnight, Bartley was burning. Dacian didn't call an ambulance. Ambulances meant questions, police, and social services. Instead, he scooped the boy up, the blankets and all, and carried him into the master's suite, a room no one, not even his lovers, was allowed to enter. He laid Bartley in the center of the massive bed. The boy looked impossibly small against the dark gray silk, a pale speck in a sea of charcoal. His breathing was shallow, rapid, and painfully loud in the silent room. Dr. Eris, Dacian barked into his phone, carrying a basin of cool water to the bedside. Now. For the next 48 hours, the most feared man in the city became a nurse. The master bedroom, usually a shrine to minimalist luxury, was transformed into a high-end triage unit. IV stands glittered under the chandelier. Oxygen tanks hissed rhythmically. The air smelled of rubbing alcohol and fear. Dacian sat in a velvet armchair pulled right up to the mattress, his jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up. In his hand, he didn't hold a Glock or a knife. He held a digital thermometer. He stared at the small plastic device with the same intensity he usually reserved for dismantling a bomb. He waited for the beep, his jaw clenched tight. 103.4. It's not going down, Deson growled, looking at Dr. Eris, who was checking the IV drip. The antibiotics need time, Desion, the old doctor said gently. His immune system is depleted. Malnutrition, exposure, stress. It's a perfect storm. He just needs to rest. He needs to breathe, Deson corrected, dipping a washcloth into the cool water. He wrung it out with hands that had broken bones and strangled enemies, using a touch so light it barely skimmed Bartley's burning forehead. On the bedside table, Desion's secure phone began to vibrate. It danced across the mahogany surface, an angry, persistent buzz. It was Marco. Then it was the capos. Then it was the council. Tonight was the quarterly sit-down. The heads of the 5 families were gathering at the warehouse to discuss territory lines. Deseon's empty chair would be seen as an insult, a sign of weakness, or a declaration of war. Deson looked at the phone. He looked at the name flashing on the screen. Then he looked at Bartley. The boy whimpered in his fever sleep, his hand reaching out blindly into the air. Deson caught the small, hot hand in his own large, calloused one. Bartley's fingers curled around Desion's thumb, anchoring himself to the only safety he knew. Without breaking his gaze from his son's face, Desion reached over with his free hand and silenced the phone. Then he turned it off completely. Let them wait, Desion murmured, the words final. Nah, let them burn the city down. I'm not going anywhere. He placed the cool cloth on the boy's brow, listening to the hitching breath, terrified by the realization that for all his power, for all his money and his soldiers, he couldn't bully a virus into submission. He could only sit and wait and hold the hand of the boy who had unknowingly brought a warlord to his knees. The fever broke on the 3rd morning, leaving Bartley weak but undeniably alive. The silence of the sick room, which had felt like a holding cell for death, was suddenly filled with the soft, scuffing sounds of socks on marble. Deseon had spent a decade building a fortress designed to keep people out. He hadn't realized until now how poorly designed it was for keeping a curious 9-year-old in. By noon, Deseon found Bartley standing at the end of the West Hall, his hand hovering over the heavy iron handle of the door that led to the basement. The basement wasn't a playroom. It was soundproofed. It had drains in the concrete floor. It was where the business happened that couldn't be discussed in boardrooms. Bartley! Deson's voice cracked through the hallway like a whip. The boy jumped, snatching his hand back as if the metal were white hot. He spun around, eyes wide, waiting for the shout. Deson forced his shoulders to drop. He forced the tension out of his jaw. He walked over, placing a large hand on the boy's shoulder, steering him gently but firmly away from the darkness below. We need rules, Deseon said, guiding him back toward the sunlit safety of the living room. If you're going to live here, you need to know the geography. He sat Bartley down on the sprawling leather sofa. The boy looked small against the dark upholstery, his legs swinging, barely reaching the edge. Rule number 1, Deseon said, holding up a finger. The basement is off limits. It's structural, unsafe. You never go down there. Not for hide and seek, not for exploring, never. Bartley nodded vigorously. Okay, no basement. Rule number 2. Deseon pointed to the red phone sitting on the mahogany side table. It had no dial pad, only a blinking light. That phone is not a toy. If it rings, you don't answer it. You come get me. If I'm not here, you let it ring. You don't speak to anyone on that line. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Bartley whispered. He looked at the phone with suspicion, as if it might bite him. Deson exhaled, leaning back. He felt more exhausted explaining basic safety to a child than he did negotiating truces with the triads. He was used to commanding fear. He wasn't used to managing curiosity. Bartley looked around the room, taking in the vaulted ceilings, the original oil paintings, and the view of the skyline that cost more than the city's entire sanitation budget. He looked back at Deseon, his brow furrowed in genuine puzzlement. Mr. Deseon? Just Deseon, he corrected. Or whatever you want. You have a really big house, Bartley said softly, and you have guards, and a pony. Deseon shifted uncomfortably. I do. What do you do? Bartley asked. The question hung in the air, innocent and devastating. My mom said you were a soldier, but you don't wear a uniform. Deson looked at his hands. They were clean, manicured, and steady. No, but in his mind, they were stained with things he could never wash off. He thought about the men he had intimidated, the shipments he had moved, the problems he had made disappear in the very basement he had just forbidden Bartley from entering. He looked into his son's eyes, Elena's eyes, and realized he couldn't tell him the truth. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I'm a consultant, Desion lied smoothly, the words tasting like ash, in waste management. Bartley tilted his head. Like garbage trucks? Desion's mouth twitched in a grim, humorless smile. Something like that. I help clean up the city. I take care of the mess nobody else wants to deal with. Bartley nodded, seemingly satisfied. That's good. Trash makes the streets smell bad. Yeah, Desion murmured, looking away toward the window where the city sprawled below them, gray and unforgiving. It sure does. The silence of the Cha estate had always been heavy, a suffocating blanket woven from secrets and the stale air of a life lived in the shadows. But in the week following the fever, the texture of that silence began to change. It wasn't empty anymore. It was expectant. It was raining again, a relentless gray drizzle that usually turned Dishon's mood as dark as the sky. But today, the fireplace in the library was crackling, casting a warm, flickering orange glow across the room. Desion sat on the Persian rug, his long legs folded awkwardly beneath him. Opposite him, sitting cross-legged in a pair of brand-new, slightly too big pajamas, was Bartley. Between them sat the jade chess set Marco had bought, a board that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, now being used as a teaching tool for a 9-year-old. No, Deson said, his voice a low rumble. He reached out, his large hand hovering over Bartley's. The knight doesn't move like that. It's tricky. It moves in an L, 2 steps forward, 1 step to the side. Bartley frowned, his brow furrowing in intense concentration. He picked up the cool green stone piece. Like this? He moved it, hopping over a line of pawns to threaten Desion's bishop. Desion blinked. It was a legal move. It was an aggressive move. Exactly like that, Desion murmured, a flicker of pride igniting in his chest. You bypassed the defense. You went for the throat. Bartley looked up, confused. The throat? The weak point, Desion corrected quickly. You went for the weak point. Bartley grinned. It started as a small thing, a twitch at the corner of his mouth, but then he looked at the board and realized he had trapped the demon of the district, and the dam broke. He giggled. The sound was foreign in the high-ceilinged room. It bounced off the leather-bound books and the dark wood paneling, bright and clear and utterly uncorrupted. It wasn't the nervous, terrified sound from the pony incident. This was genuine delight. The giggle spiraled into a full laugh, a bright, pealing sound that seemed to physically push back the shadows in the corners of the room. Bartley covered his mouth with both hands, his eyes crinkling into crescents, Elena's crescents. Desion sat frozen. He felt a strange pressure in his chest, an expansion that was almost painful. He had spent 10 years feeling nothing but cold resolve and burning anger. He had forgotten that other things could fill a room. He looked at the boy, Ton, who was now rocking back and forth, laughing at his own cleverness. The grim, mausoleum-like atmosphere of the mansion shattered. The ghosts that usually haunted Desion, the faces of men he'd killed, the memory of Elena leaving, seemed to retreat, pushed back by the sheer force of a child's joy. Desion's own mouth twitched. The muscles felt rusty, unused. Slowly, almost against his will, a smile broke across his face. It wasn't his business smile, the one that terrified debtors. It was soft. It was real. Okay, Grandmaster, Desion said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. Don't get cocky. The game isn't over. Bartley stopped laughing long enough to beam at him. I'm gonna win, Dad. The word hung in the air, casual and unplanned. Dad. Dacian didn't correct him. He couldn't. He realized with a sudden, terrifying clarity that he didn't want to be anywhere else. He didn't want the clubs, the respect, the fear, or the power. He just wanted to sit on the floor in the rain and lose a chess game to his son. He was happy. And that, he knew, was the most dangerous thing of all. The rain that lashed against the warm windows of the Cha Library was the same rain falling on the rusted corrugated roof of a warehouse in the West End. But here, it didn't sound like a lullaby. It sounded like shrapnel. Inside the warehouse's office, the air was thick with the smell of stale cigar smoke and ozone. The only light came from a flickering fluorescent strip that buzzed like a trapped fly. Vargas, the head of the Viper Syndicate, sat behind a metal desk that was scarred with knife marks. He was a man of sharp angles and nervous energy, a hyena constantly looking for a lion's throat to rip out. For years, he had been starving. Dacian Cha, the demon, the ghost, the unkillable wall, had taken every inch of territory that mattered. Vargas spun a butterfly knife between his fingers. Click, clack, click, clack. The rhythm was hypnotic, a metronome counting down to his inevitable defeat. "He doesn't make mistakes," Vargas muttered to the empty room. "He doesn't sleep. He doesn't eat. He doesn't feel." That was the problem. You couldn't bribe a man who had everything. You couldn't threaten a man who cared about nothing. Dacian Cha was a machine, and machines didn't bleed. The phone on the desk vibrated. It wasn't a call. It was a single encrypted message. Vargas stopped the knife. The blade hovered an inch from his thumb. He hadn't expected this. His mole inside the Cha estate, a gamble he had paid a fortune for, had been silent for weeks. He assumed the rat was dead, buried under Dacian's rose bushes. He picked up the phone. The screen cast a corpse blue light over his face. There was no text, just an attachment. Vargas tapped the screen. The image loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, resolving into a grainy, high-contrast photograph taken from a telephoto lens. It was the Cha estate's private garden. The high walls, usually topped with razor wire, were visible in the background. But in the foreground, focused with crystal clarity, was something that shouldn't exist. A child. A boy, maybe 9 years old, wearing a coat that was too big for him. He was crouching in the dirt, holding a plastic trowel, laughing at something just out of frame. And at the edge of the picture, blurred but unmistakable, was a hand reaching out to steady him. A hand with a distinctive tattoo of a dragon scaling the wrist. Dacian's hand. Vargas stared. He zoomed in on the boy's face. He saw the softness. He saw the joy. He saw the terrifying, undeniable truth that Dacian Cha was keeping a pet. No, not a pet. The resemblance was there, buried under the youth, but present in the eyes. A son. Vargas let out a breath that sounded like a hiss. The knife in his other hand snapped shut. The unkillable machine had a flaw. The armor had a crack. The demon wasn't a ghost anymore. He was just a father. And fathers were easy to kill. They were predictable. They were weak. Vargas looked up at the darkened doorway where his top enforcer stood waiting. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face, like stretching the scar on his lip until it looked like a second mouth. "Prepare the trucks," Vargas whispered, the excitement making his voice tremble. "And bring the heavy rounds." He turned the phone around, sliding it across the desk so the enforcer could see the smiling boy in the garden. "The demon has a heart," Vargas said, his eyes gleaming in the dark. "Go cut it out."